Well, g'day, folks. Today we're chatting to Professor Fontana. He's an internationally recognised physician scientist and one of the world's leaders in the field of nutrition and healthy longevity in humans on Legends with Bevo.
Welcome to Legends with Bevo. Thanks to the Holdy, Coopers, Anytime Fitness Glenelg, and Paradise Mazda. And now, here's your host, Bevo.
Professor Fontana, great to have you on Legends with Bevo. Thanks for taking the time to have a chat. Now, you've got a book out at the moment called Path to Longevity, which is to do with reaching the same stamina as a 40-year-old when you reach the age of 100. Tell us more about it. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it's a provocative subtitle, but it's not totally crazy because it's based on research on animal model of longevity, and we know that it's feasible. We have seen in several dietary and genetic animal models, these animals, even if they are the equivalent of a 100 years old man, physiologically, biologically, they look like a 40, 50 years old, so it's not totally crazy, but, it was a provocative subtitle, of course.
And what's your passion for longevity and healthy lifestyle? Where's it all come from?
Well, everything started, when I was a teenager, and I had an uncle, his name is Francesco, who was a scholar in traditional Chinese medicine, yoga, Oriental philosophies. And so, I was raised, with his uncle telling me about all this story about how you should do, to promote your health, your mental health, your spiritual health, the importance of diet, exercise, and mindfulness. And then, I went through my medical school, my residency in internal medicine. And as I was practicing medicine, I realized that, really the main focus of medicine was treating diseases. It was not preventing them. Basically, as doctors, we are mainly trained to make diagnoses of diseases that typically take between 30 and 40 and 50 years before they become disease. Normally you go to a doctor because you have chest pain, you have, blood in your feces, you have a nodule in your breast or a skin, a lesion, and then you ask, doctor, what is this? Can you tell me what it is? And so we are trained, to make a number of laboratory tests or imaging tests. And so, that, we have a better idea of what is the diagnosis. And then most of our training is prescribing drugs or surgery or both. Okay. So I was not happy with that. I said, I don't want to spend the rest of my life, to treat diseases that, we knew in principle that could be preventable. And so I said, I want to study more on this topic. And, I started to search when I was a resident. I'd spent 1 year in London doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the St. Thomas's Hospital. And then, I went to the United States, at Washington University, where I was working with one of the greatest pioneer of exercise physiology. He just died a couple of years ago. His name was John Hollinsey. John Hollinsey came to Australia in 2000, you don't believe it, to get the gold medal, the Olympic gold medal for his discovery in exercise physiology. So he got the gold medal and $500,000 US dollars prize as a recognition for his major discoveries in exercise physiology.
Incredible.
Yes.
What a great person to work with. And you must have learned so much from working with him. And again, I'm sorry to hear about him passing away a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it was a fantastic and amazing experience because, at the beginning, we started to work as the typical relationship, the boss, the principal investigator, the professor, and the young researcher, doctor, trying to build his career. But after 10 years, we started to become close friends. He was like a father for me. And so, there was this, very empathic relationship. It was not only based on science, but it was also based on personal relationship. We spent, I was spending probably every day or every other day an hour, and we were talking about everything, research and philosophy and this and that and life. And so, we were very, very close. And I was lucky because, again, he was one of these very brilliant, these pioneering people who were really, trying to make breakthrough, discoveries. He was, just to give an example, he was the guy who discovered that exercise is increasing mitochondrial biogenesis. So basically, when you exercise, you are increasing the number of mitochondria, and therefore you are becoming more fit. You have higher VO2 max, and so you are able, to perform better. He was the guy who discovered that exercise is increasing GLUT4. GLUT4 is this glucose transporter that, after half an hour of exercise, a bout of exercise, you have an increase in this GLUT4 on the cell membranes of the skeletal muscles. And so you have more glucose going into your cells. And for athletes, it's important because as you consume glucose, the glycogen in your muscle, this GLUT4 is important for the glycogen supercompensation after you stop exercise and you ingest carbohydrates. These carbohydrates, they replete the glycogen stores within the muscle. It's very important, for the production of ATP and for the prevention of lactic acidosis. So this is just two of the major discoveries that, John did.
That's phenomenal. And obviously at the moment we're all going through a tough time with COVID-19 and, around the world. And luckily in Australia it's not as bad as what we're seeing, with your hometown Italy, of course. But anxiety is one thing that a lot of people are suffering. And obviously one thing that people would love to know from you is what sort of foods they can eat perhaps to help with anxiety and also with boosting immunity against COVID-19 and also the flu, which is something that's coming up with flu season not far away.
Look, what we know is that based on many papers that have been published recently, is that probably the risk of developing of contracting COVID-19 is not very different from people who have diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, obesity, but the risk of ending up in ICU or dying is much higher in people who have hypertension, type 2, so they have type 2 diabetes, or they have hyperglycemia, they have cardiovascular disease, they have cancer, and they are obese. And so what I think is important is that people, they start to realize that, they can change these parameters pretty quickly. So if they do a balanced diet together with a exercise program, we have clearly shown in many studies, not only my lab, but other labs, that, some of these cardiometabolic risk factors that are increasing the risk of having serious consequences if you are contracting COVID-19 can be quickly and rapidly reduced. And so the good message is that, we don't know how long it's going to take, to get a vaccine, if we're going to get a vaccine that is going to work. But definitely, if we improve our health, our metabolic health with healthy diet and exercise, we can reduce our risk of ending up in hospital, or even worse, in ICU, or of dying if we are unlucky and we get exposed to COVID-19. Then there is also the psychological. In my book, I'm also talking about how through mindfulness and other practices you can improve your mental health. You can learn how to be more proactive, more serene, more have, to develop a better, what is called emotional health, so that you're able to cope with stress in a much better way than if you are just if you are not able to exercise yourself in this domain that is our emotional health, the stress, and so there are techniques people can use to, everybody knows, if you exercise constantly, if you go for a run, if you bike, if you swim, you gradually improve your fitness, your performance, and it happens pretty quickly. If you go constantly, if you start to build up training, you're going to improve your physical performance and fitness. Similarly, if you work on your brain, if your mind, you can pretty quickly improve your resilience, your emotional health, your mental health, and there are several studies showing that that's possible. And I'm talking about those studies and the knowledge in a simple way. Basically I try to simplify language. Being a doctor and a scientist, for me sometimes it's difficult, so I tried hard to simplify these messages, so that every person, even people who are not specialists, can have some input on how to do it.
And what motivates you to, or I guess when you were younger, what motivated you to pursue a career in medicine, Professor Fontana?
Well, I think it was both a personal interest. I was interested in the human body, how the human body works. How we can keep our body healthy, and understanding these fantastic body and the function of the body. And at the same time I was also interested in helping other people, try to help other people to stay healthy and potentially to treat diseases if they occur. And so that's where the two major motivation. I remember I was still a kid. I was 5 years old, 6 years, no, probably 7 years old when I was in primary school, and I really liked to draw the human body. I remember I had these beautiful not paintings, but drawings of the heart, of the lungs, and the bones. And I think it was a passion since I was a kid. Yeah,
that's wonderful. I love it. And what's there's a lot of talk about eating less helps with aging. What's your philosophy on this?
Look, the data in animals are pretty strong. The most powerful intervention to extend lifespan and health span is dietary restriction without malnutrition. There are now hundreds, or I will say thousands, of papers in yeast, worms, flies, mice, rats, and now even monkeys showing that if you reduce caloric intake by 20-30% without malnutrition, meaning with all the vitamins, minerals, and basically that are important for health, you can extend lifespan up to 50% longer. That means that instead of living 80 years, these animals, they live 120, 130 years. There is a study, two studies in US. One is the Wisconsin primate CR study, and the other one is the National Institute of Aging primate study. These are rhesus monkeys that have been randomized for 20 years on calorie restriction or control ad libitum. So the monkeys can eat as much as they want. And instead of in the calorie restricted monkeys, it was a 30% reduction in caloric intake compared to what they would eat ad libitum. And a third of these monkeys, they lived the equivalent of 120 years for humans. And there is one called Sherman who just died that was the equivalent of 129 years for humans. Because, on average, a rhesus monkey lives 27 years. These monkeys, they've been living more than 40 years. And this, in particular, this Sherman monkey lived basically I think it was 42 years. That is like the equivalent of 129 years. This is 7 years longer than Juliet Carmet, that is the longest lived human being on earth, who lived 122 years and I don't remember how many days. So the data we have is that diet is super powerful in slowing aging and in the preventing multiple chronic diseases. I'm one of the top world expert on calorie restriction in humans. So my lab in United States has published many papers on the effects of dietary restriction in humans, from metabolic to cardiovascular adaptations to molecular changes. We collect the skeletal muscle biopsies, colon mucosa biopsies, a range of metabolic and physiological parameters, and we have shown that dietary restriction works in humans as well in terms of improving metabolic and physiological health. So again, that's the literature, and the literature is not like one or two papers. It's pretty extensive. There are so many information right now, but compared to when I started 17 years ago to work in this field, where there were two major dogmas. One, the more calorie restriction, the better. The second dogma was that the quality of the food was unimportant. What was important was only the caloric intake. Both dogmas now we know they are not true. It's not true that the more calorie restriction, the better. Each one of us has a specific amount of calories that are optimal for longevity. If you are overdoing calorie restriction, that's bad for your health. And if you are eating more calories than you need, that's bad for your health. The other, again, dogma that is not true is that, the composition of the diet is not important. Right now we know, that the timing of when you eat the food, so the fasting or the 16-8, the time restricted feeding, the 16-8 diet is, so when you eat your food is very important. The composition of proteins, so the quantity of proteins and the quality of proteins seem to be very, very important in regulating the effects of calorie restriction. And then also other factors like fibers and other phytochemicals through the gut microbiota is also important for regulating health. So there are several factors that are important. So now in this short interview is impossible, to summarize. In my book, I think, there are like probably 80, 90 pages on this dietary intervention. And so I make all the history, that what I think is the best evidence. Of course, is my point of view, but, I've been working, again, I have a degree in medicine, I get a residency, a PhD in metabolism. I've been working 17 years at Washington University, one of the best university in US on this topic. And I just arrived in Sydney almost 2 years ago, where I'm the director of the Healthy Longevity Program at the Charles Perkins Center. And I'm the Leonard P. Ullman Professor of Translational Metabolic Health at University of Sydney. So I think, I can say I have a pretty good understanding of what is a healthy diet, because I work in this field and I know all the most important people working in this field, in the world, because our colleagues, and, we work together, we collaborate together. So, I think, my point of view is my point of view, of course, but I think, it's pretty, I'm pretty knowledgeable on the pro and cons.
Yes, I think you've got the runs on the board, over 120 manuscripts. That's pretty good effort. Now, obviously, you're from Italy originally. The viewers may not know this or not. And they love their pasta and pizza over there in Italy. But there's always talk about the carbs are evil for you and not good for you. What's your take on this? I guess from someone that loves pasta and pizza, Professor Fontana.
Look, the pasta and pizza is a new, the traditional Mediterranean diet, and there is a chapter on that. My father is from North Italy, and my mother is from South Italy, from Calabria. And so, I was raised, with a grandmother that was, an expert of cooking healthy, tasty Mediterranean type of foods. And the white bread, the refined carbs, now are typical of even the Italian diet, has nothing to do with the traditional Mediterranean diet. So the diet of my grandmother was a lot of different type of vegetables, cooked in many different types with a lot of spices and pepper and stuff like that, and then it was whole grains. So basically, they were getting the wheat, the whole wheat, and they were grounding it, fresh, and then they were doing whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta with a lot of type of legumes, chickpeas, lentils, and borlotti, so fava beans, and they were. I still remember, my grandma, putting together these fantastic meals, so tasty, and so basically a typical idea that the Italian are eating pizzas and pasta is false, because this is new. This is a new, after the Second World War, a lot of Italians, because they become wealthier, after the Second World War, Italy had a huge economic growth. It was, in fact, it's still one of the G9 countries, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, even if, we have some financial issues right now, but still, we are one of the most wealthiest countries in the world. And because of that, after the Second World War, the lifestyle of Italians has changed drastically. So, for example, when Ansel Keys, that was the father of the Mediterranean diet, he was the first guy that started to study the Mediterranean diet, went to Naples. Myocardial infarction in Naples was unknown, and he has written few papers reporting this fact. Basically, when he went to Naples in the early 1950s, you couldn't see any myocardial infarction in Naples, in the Naples hospitals. In contrast, in US, there was an epidemic of people developing and die of myocardial infarction, and they were pretty young. And so he started to study why there was this major difference between the South Italy, the Napoli and other areas of Italy, and US or UK. And he found, and he writes in his papers, that basically the Italians back then, they were eating homemade pasta and bread with lots of vegetables, olive oil as a dresser, and fish, and no potatoes, no butter, meat once a week, and the dessert was fruits. So this was the typical, traditional Mediterranean diet, when the incidence of myocardial infarction was basically zero. Now the incidence of myocardial infarction in Naples is as high as in London or New York or any other town in Western country, because the people in Naples, they have drastically changed their diet. They're eating huge quantities of refined carbohydrates, white bread, white pasta, white, pizza with a lot of cheese, a lot of meat, a lot of salami, sausages, and we know that these two combination of refined carbohydrates, super processed food, together with a lot of animal products, are two of the major drivers of cardiovascular disease and other diseases.
So hence why it's good to have it all in moderation, hey?
Yeah, but in moderation it depends. There are studies showing the moderation in eating junk food is not good for your health. There are a couple of important papers I cite in my book that published in high impact factor journals. When people say everything in moderation, it depends. Because everything in moderation means you eat moderation also junk food, that's not good for health. In fact, is a predictor of obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other diseases. So everything in moderation. If you eat healthy food, then of course, if you once in a while, you go out with friends and you want to, enjoy and drink a bit more, eat a bit more, there is no problem. We don't have to become like monks. But, if you have a healthy diet and healthy lifestyle most of your week, and then, you have, one day where, you have, you eat a bit more and you drink a bit more, that's fine, no problem.
And what's the benefits of this? Everyone's talking about this high protein, low carbohydrate diet. What's the benefits of this in your opinion, Professor Fontana?
Well, I don't think there is any benefit. I think it's a fad. It's a fad diet that is now very, very trendy, and is a response. Basically, when Ansel Keys, again, went to Italy in the 1950s, as I said, there was an epidemic of cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction in US and in many Northern European countries, unlike Italy, Greece, and Japan. And because of his research and other investigator research, they found that basically smoking and a high animal fat diet was responsible for this epidemic of myocardial infarction. So the stupid response of the science and industry was, okay, so if animal fat is bad, let's substitute animal fat with carbs. But they didn't substitute, the animal fat with healthy carbs. They substitute, the animal fat with refined carbs, sugar, high fructose beverages, and, white bread, white pasta, all these refined carbs. And the result is an epidemic of obesity. An unprecedented epidemic of obesity. Now, basically, 70% of Americans and Australians, they are either overweight or obese. And so now the new answer to this epidemic of obesity is a high protein, low carb diet. But, we have clearly shown in animal studies, and, we have data in humans now, that, if you have an excessive consumption of animal proteins in general, but especially animal proteins, you are driving some of the most powerful pro-aging, pro-cancer pathways, that is the insulin, IGF-1, mTOR pathway. So if you feed this IGF-1 mTOR pathway an excessive amount of animal proteins, especially sulfur amino acids and branched-chain amino acids, you are driving this pro-aging, pro-cancer pathway. So you need the right amount of proteins, and the right amount of proteins is approximately 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. That is approximately 60 grams of protein per day. So there are beautiful studies, randomized clinical trial studies show that, when you eat 30 grams of protein per meal, you're already saturating the synthesis of new muscle. So, if you eat in excess of 30 grams per meal, you are not transforming this excess protein into muscle. It gets oxidized, or even worse, it triggers the activation of this pro-aging, pro-cancer pathway. Unless you are a super bodybuilder. And of course, if you are a big gym and you are competing to become Miss Universe, Mr. Universe or Miss Universe, then, probably, yes, you need more proteins. But, for regular people with their regular lifestyle, even people who are doing some, exercise in the gym, you don't need all this high protein. And this high protein is driving pro-aging, pro-cancer pathway, and has a lot of other issues. And the data, there is a couple of chapters in my book where I explain the science of it.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And just let me add another part. A lot of people, they say, look, the paleo diet, because, all the problems started, when people, they stopped being hunter-gatherers and they became, farmers, and they started to grow grains. And so the grains are all the problems. Instead of, if you're eating lean meat, lean game, and fish, and no carbs, you're going to be healthy. There is no evidence whatsoever. And I'll tell you 2 reasons why. So if you take the Pima Indian, or even the Aboriginal here in Australia, basically, there is no data that any of these people, they lived a long life. So a lot of people say, yes, but they were healthy. Yes, but when they were 50, 60, they were all dead. And these people, they were exercising like crazy because, they were horse riding, they were, hunting all day long. They lived in a pristine, basically no polluted environment. They were eating lean meat because they were eating bison and game, not farm meat. And yet, none of these guys lived, more than 60, 65, at the most 70 years. And instead of, in the same time, in Okinawa, where there is the higher number of centenarians in the world, they were, again, centenarians, and these centenarians, they were not eating a high protein diet. We have data from the Americans when in the 50s they occupied Okinawa, because as you know, right now Okinawa is still has a big American base, on the island. When they went there, the army and the doctors of the army, they took, some food diary. So they were checking what these Okinawans were eating. And basically their diet was a high complex carbohydrate diet with a lot of fruits and vegetables and some beans from soy and other beans. And they were eating fish probably 2-3 times a week and pork or meat once a month. So the evidence that these paleo people are bringing on the table suggests, that the problem of all the disease are due to the carbohydrates is false, both anecdotically, as I told you now, but also scientifically, because we have plenty of beautiful papers in animals, again, showing that, when you have an excess protein intake, you are driving aging and cancer. So bottom line, stay away from this high protein diet. They are bad for your health.
Very, very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. That's someone that's loves their meat. That's something I'll certainly take on board. Now, for those people out there that are watching today or listening, you've been on an incredible 35 different television shows throughout your time, and one of those shows was actually with the great Oprah Winfrey, one of the best television hosts of all time, of course. So what was that experience like, and what was your involvement on there, Luigi?
Well, it's, as you said, because of my papers, when I was in US, I've been interviewed, and I had, I think, the most famous, was the documentary of Michael Mosley, that gave birth to the 5-2 diet. I was one of the main characters. Me and Walter Longo were the 2 main characters of the Eat Fast and Live Longer. So basically, the 5-2 diet was launched because of our research, and then I've been in another couple of BBC documentary on CNN and a few other ones in Italy. 3 or 4 documentaries in Japan, in Brazil, and so it was a nice experience. And recently, I was on a new documentary here on health and longevity by the ABC. We went filming here, north what is called the forest here, Quaringa Forest is north of Sydney. It was a nice experience. You go there with all the crew and they film you. You are like acting like an actor where, they ask you to repeat, please, can you repeat this one now because it doesn't sound well, can you do this, can you do that? So it was quite nice. But I think, I'm doing this one, because I think, it's important that, our science gets out of the lab, because typically as scientists, we do science, we write papers, and we communicate the results of our studies among us. We go to conferences and, you present your data to your other colleagues. But the taxpayers, who are really the people who are funding the university and the research, normally they get the information through some small piece of on a newspaper, so there is not like a well described, idea of what we have achieved, with this science. And that's why, when they asked me to participate in these documentaries, or as I said, I decided to write this book because I said, okay, enough is enough. There are all these books, on paleo diet, on vegan, on this, on that. There are so many fad diets. Every day there is a new fad. Everybody is entitled, I'm a top model. Look how beautiful I am. And so this is my book on nutrition. Okay. So that's how I eat, because I'm beautiful. No, you are beautiful because you had two beautiful parents and you were genetically lucky. You got two beautiful parents. And so you are a top model. But that doesn't mean, you know what eating healthy means. And so there is a lot of confusion out there, I think. And so that's why I decided to write a book that is not only talking about diet, but is talking about exercise, different type of exercises. So, in the exercise part, I told, all the discovery of John Holody, my research, because I also did studies on exercise comparing with diet. And then, there is all the cognitive training, the mindfulness. There are other techniques that, sleeping is very important. Social ties, we underestimate how important is friends and family. People who are alone, they live alone, they have the same risk of dying than if they smoked 15 cigarettes per day. Okay. So people, they under-realize that, longevity, health and longevity is not due to one factor. The paleo diet, the vegan diet, or exercising hard is like a beautiful jigsaw puzzle where, there are all these pieces that you have to put together in the right way so, you get the best result. And so that's why I decided to write this book that, gives, like a holistic but scientific based. In the book, there are 1,600 citations. So every single sentence, there is one or more citation, because I want that people start to learn to say, okay, this guy said this one, let me see if it's true. At least, they can go and look where I got this information. I mean, you can disagree with me. Nobody knows everything. So the message is, if someone tells you, I know, that's impossible, because the complexity of how the human body works and all the mechanisms regulating aging, health, and longevity is very, very complicated. And so basically, each one of us has his own particular, so you can put together this information in a different way. But, if you want to learn how to play piano, if you want to become a professional pianist, or if you want to become a professional athlete, who you're going to look for? You're going to look for the best trainer. And the best trainer has a lot of experience because for many, many years, he has been practicing what he's teaching, okay? You don't go to the top model to learn to become a violinist, a successful violinist, or you don't go to the, whatever, to become, an Aikido or a karate sensei. You go to you have to go to the best karate sensei, practice with him, and try to extract the information that he gained over many, many years of experience. And so you can learn to become a good, karate black belt. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. And obviously you've worked, in Australia for a couple of years, as you mentioned now, and you've spent time all around the world. How do you compare the Australian health system to other overseas health systems, Luigi?
Well, you know, compared to the US system, the Australian system is a very good system. First of all, it's a public system. So meaning that, you know, even if you are poor, you have access to free healthcare. In US, as you know, is mainly a private health system, and unless you are very, very, very poor, let's say, you know, tomorrow you lose your job in US, immediately you lose your health insurance, because normally is your employer that pays for your health insurance. Okay, and if you lose your job, you lose your health insurance. So if you go to the hospital, they're going to ask you for the credit card, unless you do not own anything. So if you have zero, if you don't have a house, you don't have anything, then, you know, there is Medicare and Medicaid for the very poor people. But let's say, you know, you own a house and you lose your job, you have to sell your house to pay for the bill of the hospital. Okay, so I think, you know, that European system, the Italian, UK, and the Australian system, instead of is more fair. Basically mean, you know, as taxpayer, you know, we pay for public free healthcare for everybody, especially for the people who cannot afford it. But, you know, like many other healthcare systems can be improved, because, you know, it's not me, but, you know, the government, you know, there are some agencies of the government who are already claiming that, you know, because of the epidemic of obesity, especially in kids, but not only in kids, as I said, you know, in Australia, 70% of men and women, they are either overweight or obese. And overweight and obesity are associated with the increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, diabetes, liver disease. And so basically this epidemic of obesity and unhealthy lifestyle is going to make our healthcare system unsustainable. So there is prediction that in the next 20 years, 25 years, the cost of healthcare is going to double in terms of GDP. Okay, so it's unsustainable unless we change and we go from a reactive system where you go to the doctor when you are sick to a proactive system where, you know, you are taking care of yourself through healthy diet, healthy exercise, and all these techniques that I explain in my book. So you are reducing the risk of developing diseases. The risk is not zero, but just to make an example, is like if you drive, you know, with your car with worn out tires, okay? Yeah. So the tires are flat, you know, they are, and it rains, your risk of having accident, of course, is much, much higher than, you know, if you are changing your tire regularly, okay? Makes sense?
Yes.
It's not zero, but it's much, much, much higher, you know, if you have flat or worn out tires compared to new tires. And so what happens is that, you know, basically, that's how our health system works. You know, I call it a sick care system. You let people go, you know, dry, you know, with worn out tires, then eventually they're going to have an accident. And depending how unlucky they are, if they have an accident in a straight road, probably nothing happens. But if they have an accident on a turn or in a very bad busy street, they may have a very bad accident, and they even may die. Okay, so then, you know, what you do when you have an accident, you go to the mechanic and say, tell me, how bad is the damage? And then, you know, basically the mechanic is trying to repair the cars, and it's going to be more or less expensive. Instead of, if we had changed our brakes, if we have changed our tires, if we took care of the car, the risk is much lower. And that's what we have to do. You know, we have to improve our health, so basically that, you know, we drastically reduce our risk of having an accident, of developing a disease, so that, you know, the healthcare system become sustainable. It's like now with the COVID, you know, why we did this lockdown, because if a lot of people, they go to the hospital, okay, at the same time with the COVID, you know, infection, and they need, you know, ICU, the number of ICU beds is limited. So instead of having, let's say in a hospital, there are like 100 beds in ICU. If you have 90 people going to the ICU with COVID, you can take care of everybody. But if you have 1,000 people going to the hospital with the COVID, and you need a ICU bed, you need to be intubated, that is not enough. And so then what happens? You have to make choices, like what happened in Italy, in Bergamo, in Brescia. What happened that, you know, the system was overwhelmed. And so even my colleagues, I'm from there, my colleagues say, you know, look, you know, we don't have enough beds. That's it. So you have to make decision who is going to die and who is not going to die.
Just awful, isn't it?
So, yeah. And so in the future, this is going to happen to the healthcare system unless, you know, we change our behaviors. And the good message is that we can drastically improve our health with healthy lifestyle. We can drastically reduce our risk of developing diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and many other diseases, including some of the most common type of cancers. It's in our power to drastically reduce the risk of developing these diseases if we know what we need to eat, do in our life.
Yeah, well said. Well, Professor Luigi Fontana, it's been an absolute blast having you on today, and so interesting hearing some of your philosophies. Our Path to Longevity is your book. I'm definitely going to get myself a copy of that, and hopefully we'll get lots of people buying it as well. Keep up the great work, mate, and thanks for reaching out. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure. You know, it's important to have people like you who are helping to disseminate some of these knowledge, so people they can make up their mind and say, okay, I believe in it or I don't. And but that's, you know, that's important that people they are exposed, you know, to information.
Yeah,
knowledge.
thank you. Yeah,
thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.